Welcome back, everyone. It's Miss Wagers, and we are going to be starting with Chapter 5, or Lesson 5, Chapters 12 and 13 today. So since we have 2 chapters to read, we're going to jump right into our lesson so we don't waste any time. Our learning intention, we are learning to identify key events so that we can summarize the story. Summarizing is one of those really important skills for good readers, so let's make sure we really focus on that today. We know we are successful when we can identify key events, identify the main idea, and then summarize the story. So let's go ahead and think about our foundational skills. Today you are working on related words. And remember, related words have the same base word. So you have one of those practice reads. So it's called My Plate for good health. And some of the related words you have are choice and choosing, confusing and confusion, eat and eating, freezer and frozen, health, healthful, healthfully, healthy, nutrients, nutrition, nutritious, and simple and simply. So again, you want to make sure that you really take your time with that reading to make sure that you're reading smoothly, you're reading all the words, you're pausing at the periods and commas, and then try and also read with a little bit of expression. I don't want any monotone stories that sound like this all the time. That's so not fun to listen to, right? So do your best with that, and we will move on to vocabulary. We're going to start with the word notorious. So I have a picture here for you, and also from the text it says, but Greg panicked. No one, not even his notorious big brothers, had ever suggested he liked a girl or that a girl might like him. And this picture here is from the ocean, and we see the sea turtle here, and there's a lot of pollution there. You can see it's something that's well known in a bad way. So pollution is notoriously bad for sea turtles, right? It's well known that that is out there, and it's very bad for them. You always hear about save the turtles. So, something that is well known in a bad way. And then we have the word stern. The principal put a stern look on her face and said, "We're not discussing the quality of your writing today." Stern. Have you ever gotten a stern look from your parents or your teacher? I bet you know what stern means. It's serious or strict. Ain't no messing around when you get that look, right? So let's go ahead and we're going to begin reading chapter 12. So it says, Mara cornered him before he got 10 feet from Mrs. Sanborn's door. Greg, look what I got last night after we talked from the library. Greg was relieved. It was just a big book. Mara had it out of her backpack and she pushed it into his hands. She was excited. It's called Understanding Comics and it's great. And I read the whole thing last night. And I think I get it. Comics, I mean, how they work. And look at this. She handed him 2 pieces of paper. There were drawings on the sheets. Right away, Greg knew what he was seeing. It was the rescue scene from Mara's mini picture book, The Lost Unicorn. First, there was a close-up of the unicorn's head with its teeth showing and nostrils snorting, and a reflection of the ogre's tower in its large, dark eye. Then there was a wide view of the creature with its head lowered as it charged the tree next to the tower, and then another close-up as its horn bit through the rough wood, complete with a spiky sound balloon. Mara had drawn the face of the princess in the tower window as the unicorn struck the tree falling against the tower, the branches cracking, leaves flying, the slippered foot of the princess on a branch of the tree, the princess pressing her face against the neck of the unicorn, and then the princess on the back of the rearing animal with the final close-up of her hand twined in the hair of the unicorn's mane. Mara had turned 2 picture book pages into 10 panels, comic book panels. Greg was speechless, blown away. The sizing of the panels, the sequence of the pictures. Mara got it. She understood how a comic worked. These were just pencil sketches, and the scale wasn't always perfect, but the drawings were still so strong, so powerful. With just a little work, and if they were inked and shaded just right, they would be fabulous. They would be dangerous. Mara was watching his face. What do you think? Are they any good? Greg tried to keep his face as blank as his mind raced ahead. If he told her how great these were, it would be like unchaining a monster that was going to turn around and eat him alive. Because if Mara could make drawings like these, she could make fantastic comic books. So let's stop and think. Mara shows Greg that she's learning to draw comic books. How does this create a problem for Greg? Well, we know that Mara is always trying to compete with Greg and trying to outdo him. And so if she starts creating these comic books, he knows that's going to be trouble. It's going to take away from his money because she's now going to be competition, just like the lemonade stand was, right? So, and selling her comics, that would be easy. Too easy. She'd get rich in no time. Mara was plenty smart. It wouldn't take her long to figure out how to make copies and how to fold and trim the pages. And here she was, standing in front of him, and she wanted him to approve, maybe even help her, give her some advice. Greg kept his eyes on the paper. Knowing that Mara was looking at his face, watching for clues, he frowned. Then he slowly shook his head and got ready to tell a lie. He looked up from the drawings. He was going to tell her these drawings were pretty bad. Tell her she'd better stick with her little picture books. Maybe tell her to give up drawing completely. And then she would definitely forget about the comics business. All this took only a second to spin through Greg's mind. He looked Mara in the eye, gave her a sad, understanding smile, and he said, but he didn't. Because Brittany Paxton and Eileen Ripley rushed up next to Mara, and Brittany said, "Ooh, this is so sweet. First, Mara and Greg have a big quarrel yesterday in math. Then Mara shows Greg a little note in social studies, and now Greg and Mara are all lovey-dovey out in the hall." Turning to Eileen, she says, "Which sounds better, Greg and Mara or Mara and Greg? I think Mara and Greg. It's perfect, don't you think?" And then came a flood of giggles. A more experienced guy would have simply turned away and gone on about his business, but Greg panicked. No one, not even his notorious big brothers, and there's that word, notorious, had ever suggested he liked a girl, or that a girl might like him. Except for that area around his left eye, Greg's whole face turned deep pink. "Don't be stupid," he snarled. "I can't help it if somebody throws paper at my desk, and I can't help it if she sticks some dopey pictures in my face either. Here, take this junk." He shoved the sketches and the book into Mara's hands and said, "Get away from me." Eileen said, "Ooh, so tough. We better call him Big Greg. Big Greg and Mara." More giggles. But by then, Big Greg was gone, hurrying to his next class, trying to put some distance between himself and that whole scene, and he succeeded. The gym was all the way at the other end of the school, and the second Greg got there, he grabbed a basketball and challenged John Elders to a quick game of one-on-one. In 2 minutes, he was breathing hard and sweating. He was losing too, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had gotten away from those girls, all of them, away from what Eileen and Brittany said, and away from their laughter. But what Greg could not get away from was the wounded look on Mara's face as he had shoved those pictures into her hands. As he charged in for a layup, he thought, "I didn't ask her to show that stuff to me. If she likes her pictures, she can go ahead and try to do something with them. It's got nothing to do with me. Like she said, it's a free country." And as he spun around and scrambled for his own rebound, he thought, "I don't owe her one thing. What's she ever done for me except steal my ideas and bother me every chance she gets?" But after saying all this to himself, Greg could still see that look on Mara's face. Chapter 13, Lockout. By the middle of third period, Greg had put the whole incident with Mara and Eileen and Brittany out of his mind. Gym class had helped. They'd had a great soccer game out on the big field, and he'd been the left forward, good for 2 goals. Plus, he'd sold 7 more copies of his comic book, and now the whole language arts class was having a big argument about which was better, Holes the book or Holes the movie. Life was back to normal. Then the intercom speaker next to the clock on the wall crackled to life. It was Mrs. Ogden, the school secretary. "Mrs. Lindahl?" "Yes." The teacher held up her hand for quiet. "Yes." All eyes swung to the speaker as if there was something to see. "Pardon the interruption. Will you please send Gregory Kenton to the office?" Mrs. Lindahl nodded at the speaker and said, "He'll be right there." Then she nodded at Greg. When the secretary said his name, Greg felt his stomach tighten, felt a tingle in his mouth and across the top of his scalp. But he pushed back the fear, stood up, and walked out the door into the hallway. The hall was empty, quiet. His cross trainer squeaked on the tiles as he walked. Greg told himself, "Could be a message from my mom, like maybe a dentist appointment after school, so I don't take the bus home." But Greg knew he was kidding himself. This had to be about something else. And when he turned the last corner and looked through the office windows, he knew Mara was sitting on the little bench on one side of the principal's door, and Mr. Z sat in the chair on the other side. So this was going to be about what happened yesterday, about arguing and yelling in math class, about getting whacked in the nose. because fighting of any kind was absolutely forbidden at Ashworth Intermediate, a huge no-no, right up there with vandalism and stealing. And Mrs. Davenport came down hard on fighting, always. When Greg entered the office, Mrs. Ogden looked up and then pointed to the bench. Greg sat down. Without turning her head, Mara whispered, "This is your fault. I have never been called to the principal's office before." Greg snorted and whispered back, "Well, boo-hoo. We didn't even fight. It was an accident. We can prove it. So relax. We're just going to get yelled at a little." Or suspended. The principal's door opened. "Mr. Xenotopoulos, Mara, Greg, please come in. Sit down." She pointed, and Greg and Mara took the chairs in front of her desk, and Mr. Z sat off to the right a few feet. Mrs. Davenport sat down. "I've talked now with Mr. Z and also with the school nurse about what happened yesterday. I understand that Greg's knock on the nose was an accident, and I'm ready to let it go at that. But I want both of you to know how serious I am about fighting. I will have none of that in this school, and I'm not going to have angry shouting or arguments either, because that's almost the same thing. You two have a bad habit of not getting along. You both need to grow out of that. But until that happens, my advice, no. My direction is that you simply stay away from each other. And to help this happen, Greg, starting Monday, you will have Mr. Scully for first period social studies, and Mara at sixth period on Monday. You will report to Mrs. Torini's level 4 math class. Any questions?" Mara shook her head. Her face was pale. She wasn't going to say a thing. She felt lucky not to be suspended or expelled. After all, she was the one who had thrown the wicked right hook. Greg also shook his head. The new schedule was fine with him. In fact, it was great. The less he saw of Mara, the better. Mrs. Davenport looked from face to face and said, "All right then, that's that." Greg put his hand on his arm of the chair, all set to stand up and leave. "Now, about this situation," the principal said, and she opened a folder. She held up a copy of Return of the Hunter in one hand and a copy of The Lost Unicorn in the other. "I saw these in Mr. Z's room yesterday afternoon, and he tells me that you two have been selling these little books around school. Is that correct?" "I've been seeing them all over, especially this one," and she shook the crayon comic. Talking fast, Mara pointed at the unicorn book and said, "I only made 5 of mine, and I mostly give them to my friends. I just sold one." Mrs. Davenport said, "Greg, what about you?" He nodded at her other hand. "I've been selling that one since Monday, and everybody really likes it, so I'm working on a whole series. Did you read it?" Mrs. Davenport seemed surprised both by Greg's chatty reply and by his question. She gave a halting nod, and Greg said, "Did you like the story?" The principal put a stern look on her face, and there's that word, stern, and said, "We're not discussing the quality of your writing today. Do you remember the talk we had right here in my office last June? I told you I did not want you selling things at school. Do you remember that?" Greg had an answer to her question, but he didn't just speak up. Instead, he raised his hand. He was about to tell the principal she was wrong, so it seemed like a good idea to wait politely for her permission to speak. When she nodded at him, Greg said, "Last June I was selling little toys, and you told me that I wasn't allowed to sell them at school, so I stopped right away, just like you said. And I'm not selling toys, I'm selling books." A student telling a principal she's mistaken, that doesn't happen very often, and there's a good reason for that. Mrs. Davenport's eyes flashed with clipped words as she said, "I know perfectly well what you are selling. This is a comic book, and in my view, comic books are practically toys, and a bad toy at that. This is hardly what I would call a book. When I saw the first one of these on Monday, and I saw your name on it, I should have called you up in here at that instant and put a stop to it, because look what's happening now." Mrs. Davenport opened the folder again and picked up 4 or 5 other little handmade comic books. She fanned them out like playing cards and held them up for all to see. Greg could only see parts of the covers, but what he saw didn't look good. The artwork was crude and poorly drawn. One cover showed an evil-looking muscle man holding a big knife, and the title was "Just in Time to Die." Another one was titled Kundun, and it showed a huge, slobbering monster biting off the top of a girl's head. After a pause to let the picture sink in, the principal said, "Because of your example, everybody now seems to think that they can make nasty, violent stuff like this, and then bring it to school and sell it." Greg put his hand up again, and this time he started speaking before the principal nodded him. But my comic's not like that. I mean, there's action in the story and things that sort of get rough, but I wasn't trying to make it violent. It's history. I based it on real Stone Age people, and I got books from the library. Mrs. Davenport waved her hand. I'm not going to have a discussion about which comic book is worse than another. I am going to say what I said to you last June, and this time let me be even clearer. Do not sell things at school. Do not sell anything. School is a place for learning and thinking. It is not a place for buying and selling. Mr. Xenotopoulos, do you have anything to add? The question caught Mr. Z off guard. Well, I was just going to say that I think it's important what you've said to Greg and Mara, and that's all. Mrs. Davenport stood up, and as if there were strings connecting everyone, the other three people popped up too. Very well, then, the principal said. We all understand one another, and I'll be making an all-school announcement during sixth grade lunch so that everyone else understands too. Now, let's all get back to work, our real work. This is a school day. And with that, the meeting ended. In the hall outside the office, Mara turned right and hurried toward the science rooms. Since his language arts class was in the room 25, Greg turned left and walked alongside Mr. Z. Neither of them spoke. About halfway down the long hall, Greg wanted to ask Mr. Z a question. He held back because the question seemed improper, too bold. But hadn't they both been knocked flat on their backs together down on the bloody math room floor? And hadn't they discussed money and careers in the Xenotopoulos toilet theory? Didn't sharing that experience mean that they were sort of related now? Not exactly blood brothers, but something, right? And so, relying on this odd feeling of kinship and hoping that Mr. Z wouldn't get offended, Greg worked up the nerve to ask the question. Mr. Z, I was wondering, do you really agree with Mrs. Davenport, with everything she said? Mr. Z hesitated half a second, and then, nodding his head, he said, Mrs. Davenport is very logical. Kids can't be scrounging around all day trying to make money at school. It's not the right place for that. But what she said about comic books, Greg asked, and my comic book. Do you think that my comic book is nasty and violent? It took 6 steps along the hallway before Mr. Z had answered that one, almost to the door of room 25. Personally, I have nothing against comic books, and as a comic book, I didn't mind yours at all. It's actually quite good. But as something to sell at school? No, Mrs. Davenport's right about that part. Greg went back to his desk in language arts class feeling a little better. At least Mr. Z wasn't lumping Creon in with those other comics. But the facts were all still pretty discouraging. He wasn't going to be able to sell his comics at school. Sure, he could still write stories and still do his drawings and still make all the comics he wanted to. And he could even try and sell them to kids some other way. But it would be so much harder. There didn't seem to be much point to it. School is where the kids were, and if the kids were his readers, his customers. And it had to happen just when things were going so well. 14 more units, and he would have made his goal for the first week. 100 comics sold. It felt like another punch to the nose. So we're going to stop here for the day. So remember, a summary includes the main ideas of a text, not every detail. Readers can summarize a text by identifying the main idea and the key events. So we're going to practice by summarizing these last 2 chapters that we read. So when we're summarizing, we need to think about the key events. And that is one of our success criteria for the day, is to identify key events in the chapter. So first off, what does Mara show to Greg after class? Think about it. What did she show him? Well, she showed Greg her comic book drawings, remember? So she rushes up to him and she says, hey, here's my drawings. So that's the key event in this chapter, is that she showed him those drawings. And then we have to think, well, what was his response to her? So how did the story move along after that? What was it? Yeah, Greg tells Mara that her comic book is bad, that her drawings are bad, right? Now I could give more details, but remember, since I just want the key details, I'm just doing the most important part. So I'm not giving all the details about how the other girls had got involved and how Greg thought that they were good, but they weren't actually good. So we just stop there and Greg tells her that they're not any good. And then what did Mrs. Davenport tell Greg and Mara at the end of these chapters? What did she say? Yeah, she told Greg and Mara to stay away from each other. And then she also tells Greg that he can't sell anything at school. So that is another key event, thinking about our stories. He's always been trying to make this money, and now he can't sell anything at school. So again, key events. We're not thinking about the whole talk with Mrs. Davenport about how she says that Greg and Mara keep arguing, how they have to stay apart, and they're having the different classes. We have stay apart, but we're not putting the different classes. And then about the selling the different things. And we also didn't include all her talk about the comic books and the different people that were making the comic books. So then to summarize, we want to think, what were these chapters mostly about? So we want to kind of put those key details together to come up with an overall idea of what were these chapters mostly about. So I could say that Greg and Mara get into another fight that lands them in the principal's office, where Greg is told to stop selling the comics. So I'm taking some of these events when Mara shows him these drawings, and they get into that other argument, and they end up in the principal's office, and Greg's told to stop selling comics. So finally, to summarize, I'm taking that main idea and my key details and putting those together. And so this is the summary that I wrote of these chapters. And notice that it's pretty short. We read 2 whole chapters, and my summary is just a few sentences long. Mara shows Greg her comic, and Greg gives her a rude response. So that was that first key event. This causes another argument that lands them in the principal's office. Mrs. Davenport tells them to stay apart and forbids Greg from selling anything else at school. So that would be the main things that have happened in this chapter. So you have to imagine when you're summarizing that, say your friend missed reading the last chapters and they say, hey, what happened in the book? You want to give them the most important details without retelling the entire story, because that would take too long. So that is what we are summarizing. So back to learning intentions, we are learning to identify key events so we can summarize the story. We know we're successful when we can identify key events. So we did that today by looking at the key events in these chapters. Check. Identify the main idea. So again, in our graphic organizer, we wrote the main idea. Check. And then summarize the story. I gave you an example, and then you are going to practice summarizing their talk with Mrs. Davenport for your reading response, which we're getting to next. Check. So, like I said, with your reading response, you are going to summarize what happened when Greg was called to Mrs. Davenport's office. Be sure to include details about the key events. So think about the most important things, like 2 to 3 things that happened while Greg was in Mrs. Davenport's office. All right. That's all for today. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Be kind to one another, do all of your assignments, and I will see y'all later. Bye.